Okay, let's get into it. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program. Why U.S. relationships in the Americas matter to the well-being of the United States. I'm Jim Van Epps again, the president of the Savannah Council. Our sponsor for tonight's program is Kreitz Auto Group, providing automotive excellence in Savannah, and they have been doing that in the Coastal Empire for over 80 years. They are our exclusive local dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes, and Sprinter vans, and we are very appreciative of Kreitz's sponsorship. Also, this program is sponsored by Planters Inn, and there isn't another hotel in Savannah that offers the extravagant amenities, elegantly appointed rooms, and historic location that you'll find at Planters Inn, and we are very grateful to Planters Inn. Also sponsoring our program this evening is Cathedral Productions. Founded as the videography vendor for the Cathedral Basilica of St. John the Baptist, Cathedral Productions has expanded to provide nonprofit and commercial marketing videography, as well as live streaming and consultation services. So thank you, Cathedral Productions. Now our speaker, we are pleased to have with us tonight retired Ambassador Thomas A. Shannon, Jr., who spent nearly 35 years in the Foreign Service, serving 6 presidents and 11 secretaries of state. Most recently, the ambassador served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the 3rd highest ranking position at the State Department. He was in charge of bilateral and multilateral foreign policy making and implementation, managed the State Department during the 2017 presidential transition, led bilateral and strategic stability talks with Russia, worked with our allies to oversee Iranian compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, expanded U.S. engagement in Asia, among other things. Prior, he served as counselor of the State Department, and in 2016, he was appointed by President Obama as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and from 2010 to 2013, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Brazil. Prior to this appointment, Ambassador Shannon served in several key positions in the State Department, the National Security Council, and the Organization of American States. Retired from government service now, he's now a senior international policy advisor in the private sector in Washington, D.C., and a visiting professor at Princeton University and co-chair of Princeton's program in history and the practice of diplomacy. And his topic is the importance of our hemisphere to the United States' prosperity and well-being cannot be exaggerated. In a world defined by expanding security challenges, we often overlook the strategic reserve we have in our own hemisphere. It's a region defined by peace among nations, democracy, markets, regional trade, and investment. It's also the world's major food and energy producer and will play a central role defining the global economy of the 21st century. The ambassador will enlighten us about the contributions our relations with the rest of America can make to the U.S. prosperity and stability and progress in the region, and will share his insights on how we can make the most of our political, economic, energy, and people-to-people relations with the other states of the Americas, and how these relationships can help the Americas meet today's broader international challenges. Please join with me in welcoming to the podium Ambassador Tom Shannon.
Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you this evening, and I want to thank the Savannah Council and Larry for inviting me on down for this event. I flew in from Washington, D.C. This morning, escaping the cold, the snow, and the coming inauguration of President-elect Trump. This is not a comment on the president-elect. It's a comment on Inauguration Day in Washington, D.C. And I work for a law firm called Arnold and Porter, which is in City Center in Washington, D.C. And fences have been going up across Washington. We're very close to the D.C. Convention Center, which is where one of the inaugural balls will be held. And so every place that either the president will be or lots of people will be, they are building walls around them and establishing access points that can be controlled by the police. And so now is a good time not to be in Washington. But it's also a pleasure to come to Savannah because I wanted to visit the United States of America and meet with Americans to talk about an important subject for me. As was so kindly noted in the introduction, and my mother thanks you. I spent much of my career in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I was what was known as a dusty roads diplomat. In other words, I wasn't allowed anywhere near the more refined settings of Rome or Berlin or London or Tokyo. Mine was Guatemala, Venezuela, Brazil, and then also time in South Africa, and then working in Washington on these parts of the world. And what was exciting for me at the time, and still is exciting as I reflect upon it, is that these were moments of extraordinary political, economic, and social change in what we then called the developing world. We now call it the global South. And American power played a role in shaping the trajectory of those transitions. And as a young officer, I saw the impact of American power, both in the political sphere, the security sphere, and the economic and commercial sphere. And it helped shape my understanding of what it meant to be an American diplomat, how it is we need to engage in the world, and what we can expect going forward, especially in our own hemisphere in the Americas. But before I dive deeper into that, I do want to note that I visited Savannah when I was 18 years old. My parents, surprised that I graduated from high school, sent me on a road trip around the United States. And I came to Savannah when it was still kind of a really newer southern town and really interesting. And coming back again and seeing this amazing city is really something. And I say this because I wasn't the first member of my family to come to Savannah. In the 1860s, I had three ancestors of my mother, Carl, Wilhelm, and August Weidner, who were members of the Wisconsin 26 Volunteers, who marched across Georgia. So first of all, I want to apologize for any misbehavior, but they liked this place. And it was a good place to end the war, as far as they were concerned. But I really want to congratulate the council for the incredible work that you all are doing here, and the way you're connecting Savannah and the people of Savannah to a larger world. And you know, I mentioned the Washington, D.C. right now. People are breathing into paper bags up in Washington as they anticipate what the new administration is going to bring and what's going to happen in Washington. But people had an opportunity to take a break from the high tension that is kind of rippling official Washington with the funeral and memorial services for President Jimmy Carter. And actually having a moment to recognize and show respect for a former head of government and head of state was not only a moment of reflection, but actually a reminder of what our democracy is and what our country stands for, and how Americans can still come together in moments of, in this instance, mourning, to talk about our own history and the trajectory of our country. And why this is important for this evening is that I believe that President Carter played a fundamental role in shaping how the United States understood our own hemisphere, but especially Latin America and the Caribbean. And he played a fundamental role in reshaping the United States' position in the hemisphere and how it related to countries in the hemisphere. And although he was only a one-term president, And in the United States, that means you have failed. I would argue that 3 one-term presidents that you can all remember, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and George H.W. Bush, were 3 of the most important presidents we've had in recent time because of things they had to do. And that eventually historians are going to get over this idea that if you're not reelected, you failed. And they're going to understand that these presidents started processes or addressed immediate, dramatic concerns in ways which, while they may not have allowed them to win a second term, they certainly fundamentally reset how the United States engages with the world. And with President Carter and our own hemisphere, he did a couple things that were noteworthy. The one that everybody knows about is the Panama Canal treaties. And I'm sure you've heard that President-elect Trump wants them back. But the thing about the Panama Canal Treaty, for those of you who can remember, is that the Panamanians were done with us. And we were seeing in Panama through the 70s and in the push into the Carter administration, political agitation, political violence in Panama, and the organization of students and regular Panamanians to protest U.S. presence in the canal zone and protest continuing American ownership of the canal, which led in one instance to 22 students being killed in violence, several American soldiers, and 1 officer in one case being killed, and the emergence of a security state inside of Panama that led to General Manuel Noriega effectively launching a coup and taking over Panama and putting the United States in a near impossible place. But what Jimmy Carter attempted to do was find a way through negotiation of the Panama Canal treaties to ensure that the United States would continue to be able to use the canal to move goods across the Pacific into the Caribbean and vice versa, while at the same time allowing the Panamanians to consolidate national power across their entire territory and to leave with the Panamanians the not only the necessary authority, but the necessary kind of budgetary structures and expertise to run the canal in an efficient way that met our concerns and our concerns to promote global trade. And this he did. And it took many years to actually effect the transfer. And I was working at the White House during the end of the Clinton administration when the transfer finally happened, so it took that long. But I would argue that in many ways what Carter did by negotiating the Panama Canal treaties was to create an environment in which the United States could engage in Latin America without being accused of being a grasping imperial power and kind of sucked venom out of, especially the left end of the political spectrum in Latin America, and opened a space for us to be able to participate in the democratization of Latin America and the Caribbean. And but other than the Panama Canal treaties, you will recall that he decided to make democracy promotion and support for human rights a fundamental piece of our foreign policy in our own hemisphere. And this was a remarkable statement because it's something that we all now accept as, well, duh, we're the United States. But it wasn't a fundamental part of our foreign policy up to that point. And it was very controversial at the time. And in fact, after he lost to President Reagan and Reagan's team came in, they made it very clear that they were going to step away from what President Carter had done and pursue a much more security-oriented focus on what was happening in the Western Hemisphere, especially in Central America at the time. But what they quickly learned was that you can't kill this problem, that absent significant political reform, absent democratization, absent a focus on human rights and an ability to break down oligarchies, especially in these smaller Central American countries, and find ways to create democratic space, that we were not going to be able to secure the isthmus in our hemisphere, and that we were actually going to make things worse. And so the irony of the Reagan administration is that they ultimately decide that the only hope of having a successful security response to insurgencies in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and then fighting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua would be to have a strong political component that consisted of democracy and human rights. And we can argue all day about how successful we've been or how successful we haven't been in that. But the fact of the matter is that became a moment in which the Carter policy was crystallized, was brought into American foreign policy, and it has stayed there over time and has become a touch point as each president since then has worked on issues related to our hemisphere. And then finally, he made fighting corruption in our hemisphere an important part of how we operated in the hemisphere, and began working with the American private sector to ensure that the American private sector was not contributing to larger corruption in our hemisphere. And so the respect for national sovereignty that was kind of defined by the Panama Canal treaties, the promotion of democracy and human rights, and making anti-corruption efforts a key part of American foreign policy were really President Carter's legacy in the Western Hemisphere. And it's a legacy that lives on. And it has not been recognized in its entirety and its, I think, fullness. But I think over time, people are going to recognize not only that the Carter presidency was profound in its impact in our own hemisphere, but that also what came afterwards, what he did afterwards in his work through the Carter Center, through his focus on public health, through his focus on election observation, through his focus on addressing public housing and infrastructure issues, is along with his presidency, all of whole cloth, of single cloth. It is all connected. And this allows me to kind of transit into a larger discussion about our hemisphere. Because if you think about this for a moment, through the 80s and 90s and then into the first part of the 21st century, the focus of American foreign policy was first securing the region, ensuring that the Soviets and the Cubans could not get leverage on us through Central America mostly. And the fear in Central America, of course, was that they would then get into southern Mexico. And once they were in southern Mexico, it was lost. The fire was lit. That was successfully done. That was successfully blocked. But as I noted, the only way it was going to be blocked in any significant long-term way was by opening these societies up and opening these economies up. And so a larger democratization process became a significant part of what we were doing, not only in Central America, but throughout the hemisphere at the time, especially in South America. And as I mentioned to you, when I came into the Foreign Service in 1984, I was working in countries that I considered to be in significant transition or transformation. And if you look at what's happened across this trajectory, you had countries that were largely authoritarian or military governed becoming democratic and civilian. You had economies that were closed, opening. You had economies whose growth models were import substitution or autarkic development, becoming built around trade and open markets. And you had countries that were largely closed to each other, building regional integration structures and building political structures that were designed to promote dialogue and peaceful resolution of disputes. And you had countries that were largely isolated from the world, suddenly globalizing. And as you look across the trajectory of this period, which really kind of comes to a culmination in the early 21st century, actually on September 11th, 2001, which we remember with horror because of the attacks in Washington, New York, and on the fields of Pennsylvania. But I was in Lima, Peru at the time with Colin Powell at a special General Assembly of the Organization of American States, where we were culminating and concluding hemispheric negotiations around something called the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was a charter that effectively stated that in the Americas, democracy is the only form of government that is considered legitimate and permitted. And in fact, the document itself went further than that. It said that democracy is a right of all the peoples of the Americas, and that the governments of the Americas have an obligation to promote and defend democracy. But it also said that democracy is essential to all forms of development, political and economic and social. And that absent democracy, you can't have integrated development programs that reflect the need and importance of social justice. It was the first time any regional organization in the world had made this kind of commitment to democracy and had insisted that it was a right for all peoples. And this was the culmination of a country-by-country acceptance of democracy and a recognition that this was the only form of government that the Hemisphere itself, through the Organization of American States, through the Inter-American Development Bank, and through all of the different committees and agencies that make up the inter-American system, would accept as legitimate. And it's striking that on September 11th, when Colin Powell was having breakfast with then President of Peru, Alejandro Toledo, the news of the first aircraft hitting the Twin Towers came through. By the end of the breakfast, the second aircraft had hit. And Colin Powell got up from the breakfast, turned to his aides, and said, "We are at war." But he did not leave immediately. He went to the site of the Special General Assembly, gave an impassioned speech to all the nation states, asking them to approve the Inter-American Democratic Charter, saying that this would be the best response to the terrorist attacks, because at the end of the day, what the terrorists were attacking were not the United States. It was open societies around the world. It was democratic governments around the world, and that this had to be a moment of solidarity between all the countries of the Americas and the United States. And indeed, that day, the Inter-American Democratic Charter was approved, but maybe even more significantly, the Collective Security Treaty of the Western Hemisphere, the so-called Rio Treaty, was invoked by all the countries in which they made a collective security commitment to the United States. And in fact, it is the countries of the Americas that made the first such commitment. They were about a couple hours ahead of NATO, if you can imagine that. And so I kind of walk you through all this because I want you to understand that the diplomacy that the United States and others had been using through the late 70s, 80s, and 90s was bearing fruit in a remarkable way that not only created a common political understanding of the Americas, not only helped facilitate common understandings about how economies work, how prosperity happens, how wealth is shared, but that we were also able to build security cooperation and a long-term commitment to democratic promotion and development that was going to remain a fundamental part of what happens through the next 2 decades of the 21st century. But here's the thing about democracy. It ain't one thing. And what is interesting about democratic development in our own hemisphere, and this will have a meaning for us today, is that we have a tendency to understand democracy in terms of process. We have a tendency to understand it in terms of elections that are free and fair, recognition of winners and losers, acknowledgement that power has to be transferred peacefully, and that this creates an environment in which societies can function and people can live peacefully. and that you use constitutional order in order to ensure that all of this happens. But what we discovered as we got deeper into this democratic moment in our own hemisphere is that the democracies that were unleashed by this democratization process opened political space for people who had never had a political voice. And over time, governments, which originally were technocratic and quite staid, began to reflect more and more of the people that they were actually representing, because these voices were being presented through democratic processes. And as they were being presented through democratic processes, we suddenly began getting governments that were worrisome for us, because they represented political positions and understandings that in some instances were either unfriendly to us or even hostile, such as Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, President Correa in Ecuador, and others who were attempting to build a counterweight to the United States, and especially a counterweight to U.S. investment, commerce, and a so-called neoliberal agenda in the Western Hemisphere. But what was useful and important about this process is that it allowed us to understand better our own partners, understand better the kind of hemisphere we lived in, understand better the kinds of societies that we were connecting with, and that we had to find ways, even in moments of real disagreement and concern, we had to find ways to build relationships with them and to develop a means of communication, cooperation, and collaboration through the array of international or regional organizations that all of these countries were part of. And so in many ways, this process of democratization and then the way in which the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean lived through their democracies and expressed themselves created a moment in which we had to come to terms with our own understanding of democracy and ensure that it was large enough that we could accommodate countries in the region and governments in the region who we knew we were going to have difficulty with. And this is an important part of what comes next, because what I would argue is that much of what concerns Americans today about our democracy, political polarization, hyperpartisanship, winner-take-all mentalities, increasingly zero-sum elections, they all start in Latin America. It doesn't start here first. It starts there first. And I would argue that increasingly, the great democracies of our hemisphere, and I'm talking about Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, but even the smaller democracies have now reached a point where they're mimicking each other. And what happens here happens there. What happens there happens here. And the extent to which we can think about this for a moment and try to understand what is happening politically in our vast hemisphere, it will determine whether or not we can be successful over time in turning this hemisphere into something that is of extraordinary value to the United States. And let me stop the focus on democracy here for a minute, just to take a step back. What was noted in the introduction is that this is an extraordinary hemisphere when it comes to natural resources, when it comes to agricultural production or food production, when it comes to renewable energies, when it comes to non-traditional energies, when it comes to fossil fuels. And it is a remarkable part of the world when it comes to arable land. There's more arable land in our hemisphere than anywhere else in the world. There's more sweet water or fresh water in our hemisphere than any part of the world. The Western Hemisphere produces more food than any part of the world. It exports more food than any part of the world. It is energy independent. It has all the resources, minerals that you need for modern industry. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, because of these political processes, it has a broad understanding of how states should operate and government should operate. It has a broad understanding of what the individual is and how that individual relates to the state. It has a broad understanding of how markets work. And guess what? Because of the regional political organizations it has and the political culture it has of dialogue that has been built between states and peaceful resolution of disputes, this is a region that, if you exclude the soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras in the 1970s and the border dispute between Ecuador and Peru in the 1970s or early 80s, this is a region that hasn't had a war since the Chaco War in the 1930s, actually no, before then, 1920s, and a major war not since the Mexican-American War or the War of the Triple Alliance in South America. In other words, it's got about 100 years at least of peaceful coexistence. So think about this for a moment. Today, President-elect Trump, on January 20th, is going to be taking office, and at 12:01, what happens to him? He suddenly owns Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, China and the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific, and Sudan, you name it. Every conflict out there, he owns in one way or another. He has to deal with, and his team have to deal with. And if you're him, you're probably thinking, why am I doing this? Can I go home now? But think about this. We sit, as we try to understand how we're going to be dealing with these extraordinary security challenges around the globe, we sit in a hemisphere that is peaceful, that is democratic, that is market-oriented, and has all the resources necessary to build prosperity and make for a peaceful life. In other words, it's this huge strategic reserve. And we don't have to worry about being attacked by Canada. We don't have to worry about being attacked by Mexico. We don't have to worry about Brazil interdicting shipping across the South Atlantic. We don't have to worry about anything that any other major power has had to worry about at any point in its history. And so you would think that in this moment, with such this huge benefit that comes from our hemisphere, that we would be doing everything we possibly can to ensure that this hemisphere stays peaceful, that it is not infiltrated and manipulated and managed from afar, and that the U.S. economy and the economies of the hemisphere are connected in ways that are meaningful and important. And this has been the larger challenge that American power has faced over time, because we are so globally spread, we are so globally scattered, that we think it's okay to spend $1 trillion in Afghanistan, but not in our own hemisphere. And Afghanistan's important to me. My son fought in Afghanistan. My two brothers fought in Afghanistan. I had a nephew who was in Kabul airport with the Marine Corps at the very end. This is not to diminish the challenges that we faced in Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11. But it is to say that sometimes we need to think a little bit harder about where we put our resources, where we put our time, where we put our money, and what kind of return we get from it. And I would argue that as we think about the world today, and as we address these challenges, the more we can focus on our hemisphere and our neighbors, the better it will be for us. Because we will recognize that, guess what? Our number one trading partner in the world is whom? Mexico. Our number two trading partner in the world is Canada. Okay. And if you look, even our trading in Central America, outpaces our trading with India significantly. And this is just something we need to keep in mind as we and our political leaders are talking to each other about what happens next in American foreign policy. Because my own view is that with the Biden administration, we are seeing the last gasp of a generational approach to foreign policy built during the Cold War and the immediate post-Cold War world. And that for the last 20 years, the American people have been having a quiet conversation among themselves about foreign affairs that political leaders have not been participating in, but that these conversations, which began around American power and principle, are now about American grievance. And they're about Americans wondering why, 30-some years after the end of the Cold War, U.S. security commitments around the world have been increasing and not contracting. And why is it that the global economy that we built, that had such a profound impact on the world, that created middle classes around the world and reduced extreme poverty all around the world, also sucked all of the industry out of the Midwest and harmed unionized labor around the United States? And the American people are wondering, how is it possible that Congresses and governments over time of both parties have not found a way to address migration issues in a sensible way, but instead have created an environment in which informality and illegality has defined migration to the United States? And this is not a political statement on my part. I'm just trying to say that we are in a moment of political change and transition in which political leadership has to come to terms with the world in a new way and has to understand the world in a new way, and that the American people are trying in the only way they know how, which is to communicate with leaders by votes, to tell people that something needs to be done. And as we think about this, and there are many answers to this, but as we think about this, it's really important we look into our own hemisphere. Because as I mentioned, we've had this dialogue about politics, economics, security for decades. It has produced important advantages for the United States. It's created a space that the United States is going to be able to use as a protected region as it addresses the rest of the world. But at the same time, we're struggling to understand how democracies are supposed to function in the 21st century. And as we engage with our hemispheric partners and neighbors, I would say that there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind, and more than a couple, but no more than 5, that we need to keep in mind. And I'm going to kind of wrap this up by giving you these thoughts, but then I want to open this up to a larger conversation, because while this is focused on our own hemisphere and why it matters, and I'm quite happy to talk about any of the countries that interest you, I'm also prepared to talk more broadly about the rest of the world. But as we try to understand what the American people are wrestling with and how we should try to understand what's happening in the world, think about this for a moment. I would assert that the enemy the United States faces today is the status quo. We have all kinds of adversaries. Some of these adversaries are going to be with us for a long time. Some won't. Some will come and go. But the thing about the United States is that throughout its history, it has never been a status quo power. It has always been a forward-looking power, and a power that has sought to use its power to shape the future. It was Abraham Lincoln who, during the Civil War, said, "We fight for a vast posterity." That is still true today. But the challenge we have is that because we are the world's only remaining superpower, There are people arguing that we need to freeze the moment. We need to grab the status quo and hold it in place. We need to make sure that our strengths and advantages are frozen in time and that our adversaries' weaknesses are frozen in time. And here's the secret. It doesn't work. That doesn't mean in the short term it doesn't make sense. Anybody who watched the movie Oppenheimer knows that when the U.S. and Germany were racing to see who got to an atom bomb first, our ability to limit German access to certain kinds of technologies, to assassinate physicists, to misdirect their research, played a very important role in allowing us to achieve a short-term advantage that allowed us to win a war. But guess what? The Soviet spies were in the room when the Manhattan Project was being done. And so we weren't able to keep the bomb away from the Soviets for very long at all. And I would argue that while this is a moving target over time, we need to be very careful that we are not seen globally as a country that is all about not letting anybody else advance while we protect our advantage. I would argue that on the contrary, we have such a remarkable economy. We have such a remarkable innovation ecosystem that we are capable not only of advancing high-tech and science development over time, but that we can empower other people as we do this. And we can create a series of partnerships and alliances that are going to make it clear that progress and advancement of societies depends on us and not anybody else. So rule number one, the enemy is the status quo. Rule number two is that all politics are social. And what I mean by that is that we live in a period of such extraordinary change, both scientific and technological, that we are on the cusp of major scientific breakthroughs that are going to fundamentally change the lives of human beings for the better, fundamentally improve the quality of human life. And the big question, both nationally and internationally, is going to be access. Who has access to these technologies? Who has access to these resources? Who has access to these opportunities? And that is really the definition of inequality or discontinuity. And these are going to be the central political issues of the rest of this century. How we manage that inequality, how we manage that access. And it kind of brings me back to my first point. This is how you empower people. And if you have any doubt about this, think about human migration. There are more people on the move today, about 300 million people, than at any time in human history. And some of it is about security, some of it is about climate change, but most of it is about opportunity. It's about people deciding, I want to be who God intended me to be, not what my village or my town or my government thinks I should be. And people migrate in order to become who they want to be. And this is going to continue to haunt us unless we can find a way to address these problems. So the enemy is the status quo. All politics are social. The third point is that values matter. In this world, power is an empty concept without principle. It's unsustainable over time, especially in democracies. We have to be able to talk about what matters to us, about what matters to individuals, about our rights, our duties, our obligations and responsibilities. And this is something that, even though the United States is often accused of misrepresenting its commitment to values as it pursues power in the world, the reality is that even in our darker moments, we have never stepped away from our values. They have always been an important part of who we are, and it's an important part of our attraction to the rest of the world. And the moment we stop talking about our values, the moment we only talk about power, we lose a large part of the world because we're seen differently. And this brings me to the fourth point, which is that as important as nation states are, and as important as nation states will be as building blocks of the international order, the reality is in the 21st century, global politics is going to be defined by societies and cultures, because it's societies and cultures that are going to be telling nation states what to do. And that the idea that national interests are immutable and that national interests are held by some elite star chamber of individuals who understand what it means for a country to pursue its interests, that is gone. It is increasingly being expressed through our societies and through our cultures. And this makes for a very complicated political environment, but it makes for one in which the United States has a huge advantage for a very simple reason. We live in a country that is global. It's not cosmopolitan, it's global. And we have societies, cultures, and communities represented in the United States that pretty much match any society or culture in the world. We have the ability to communicate out into societies and cultures and to receive communication in and understand it if we choose to. And I believe that this has to become a much bigger part of our diplomacy and how we engage in the rest of the world. And then the last point I would make is that as attached as we are to process, as attached as we are to what democracy is in terms of elections and transfer of power, peaceful resolutions of dispute and constitutional order, increasingly, in the kind of world we live in, process will not confer legitimacy. Legitimacy will be conferred by outcome, by what governments can accomplish. And this is democracy's big challenge today. Democracy has to show that it can deliver. It has to show that it can provide the resources and opportunities that people want in their lives to do what our founding fathers called pursuing happiness, which for the founding fathers was not an emotional state. It wasn't that extra beer at the end of the day. It was full realization of an individual as a person. And one of the challenges democracy faces today, and not just democracy, but authoritarian governments also, is that economic and social change driven by technology, globalization, and communication has happened so fast and has pushed change through society at such a speed that political institutions haven't been able to keep up. Political leaders haven't been able to keep up, and our institutions have not been able to keep up. And this has brought those institutions and those political leaders into question by many people, and not just here in the United States, but throughout all the great democracies of Europe and the Americas. And so I would argue that while we should be concerned about democratic process and constitutional order, we also need to be concerned about public governance. We need to be concerned about the ability of governments to get things done. And this will allow me to close by saying, not only as we look out onto the Western Hemisphere, and when we think about what we've been able to accomplish through our diplomacy in this hemisphere, as we think about how we've created this strategic reserve that gives us a degree of protection as we face major security challenges elsewhere in the world, we also have in the Western Hemisphere, in our democracies and our economies and our societies and cultures, the ability to have a larger conversation to address the issues that I've raised today, to talk about how do you get democracies to work well? How do you get democracies to deliver the goods? And how do you get our societies to create an environment in which our individuals, our citizens, feel that they have an opportunity to become who God meant them to be? And so with that, let me end my session of this and turn this over to all of you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously most of you ate dinner before you came here, but you've just been given a lot of food for thought. And I told Ambassador Shannon on the way over that this is not a bashful audience about asking questions, tough questions. So let's go. I'll come up to you if you don't mind with the microphone. This is my exercise for the day.
Thank you, Ambassador, for being here tonight. My name's A.J. Goldman. We three are teachers, high school teachers, and an elementary school teacher. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on what our responsibilities are when teaching our students now regarding these issues.
Oh, thank you for that question. Among other things, I teach both at a university and at the National War College in Washington, D.C. And the university I teach at, I teach a senior seminar. And what I realized last year is that all of my students were born after 9/11, which means 9/11 for them is what Pearl Harbor was for us, okay? It's just a historical event. But what I've learned from my students is that they understand American power very differently than I do. And they have grown up in a period of time not where you could smell World War II just by talking to your uncle, or where you lived through the Cold War, where you saw the United States defeat not only fascism but communism. But they have lived through a period of time in which American security is being challenged in the United States, where you have to take your shoes off to get on an airplane. They've lived through the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. They lived through many things which allow them to see the United States as a more vulnerable nation, but also one that is struggling with rising regional powers that could become global adversaries. And I was talking about this evening at dinner. All of you are familiar with the Charlie Brown cartoons, where whenever adults speak, it's wah, 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 wah. Well, when I talk to my college students, when a senior U.S. government official speaks, when the President of the United States speaks about foreign affairs, what they hear is wah, 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 wah. And I bet for your students it's worse. And so what I'm trying to do with my students is figure out, how do you understand the world? How can I speak to you about the world? In other words, I'm trying to find a way for them to teach me, to help me understand what concepts we can use today to build a larger conversation with them about the world. And I think in this regard, the remarkable thing about these young people is that they're connected through social media and through the world they live in. I mean, I grew up in San Diego, California. And in San Diego, California, you were white, you were black, you were Hispanic, or you were Asian. And that was a fairly diverse group. But nowadays, in a lot of communities, that's small beer. You've got people from many, many other places who speak many different languages, come from many different cultures, and how you can somehow find a way to turn that around and get the students to describe the world they live in, and get them to understand that actually they are going to be part of a generation that is going to define the new purpose of American power. I talked about how the American people are having a conversation among themselves about what the world is. I would argue that what your students are going to be able to do through political advocacy and through the way they live their lives is change the trajectory of American power in a way that is good for them and good for the United States of America. And so a lot of this is going to be about helping them understand how we got to where we are and the world in which we live in today. But I think a lot of it is going to be about listening to them and getting them to tell you what's happening. I don't know if that's helpful to you, but.
Two related questions. Exactly how involved is China in Panama? And then what is the view of the other countries of that area about all the Chinese money, et cetera, flowing in?
The answer to the first question is very involved, to the point that Panama during the first Trump administration broke its relationship with Taiwan and recognized the People's Republic of China. And that there are Chinese container facilities at both ends of the Panama Canal. But there's a reason for that. It's because that's where all the Chinese goods go. That's how they pass into the Caribbean and get to the eastern seaboard and then move on beyond that. In other words, the Panama Canal becomes a vital crossing point for Chinese goods. But it's also a vital crossing point for American goods and for goods from many other countries as they move back and forth. But listen, here's the challenge that we face in our own hemisphere with China. China is the second largest economy in the world. And if you're Brazil or Argentina, if you're Paraguay, and you have enormous quantities of wheat, other foodstuffs, animal proteins, fish proteins, China's going to buy them. And China does buy them. And in fact, during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the reason it doesn't have debilitating impact in South America is because of everything that China is purchasing. And so as the United States engages in the region, we need to find a way to engage that understands that you cannot tell other countries they can't deal with the second largest economy in the world. But you need to find ways to remind them that we're a better partner over time. And here's the next thing, the next piece of the China challenge. There was a period of time in which that was a pretty easy argument to make, because while China was buying all primary kind of goods and resources, the United States was the major provider of value-added goods. And anybody who wanted computers, anybody who wanted high-end automobiles or manufacturing and industrial equipment would come to either the United States or Germany. That's not true anymore. I mean, they still come to the United States and European countries, but China has developed really sophisticated industrial processes and very sophisticated value-added products that are useful and attractive. But more importantly, in a region that's in the midst of an energy transition and moving from fossil fuels to renewable energies, China has become a leader in electric vehicle technologies and battery technologies and in other environmental technologies. And we haven't kept pace because we've chosen not to. And our private sector has chosen not to. But also, China has decided that in order to secure its resource suppliers and secure markets, it needs to do more than just buy and sell. It needs to begin to build infrastructure. And it's building ports and railways and roadways. But more importantly, it wants to build digital infrastructure. It wants to determine how, say, South America runs its internet. And again, there's not an American company that can compete with Huawei. We have to turn to Nokia or Ericsson to do something like this. And so we have let this slip over time. But it's not an impossible challenge. It's just that we need to spend more time focused on how to respond to the needs of our partners in the hemisphere as defined by them. And one of the big challenges that the Trump administration is going to face as it engages in our own hemisphere is that because it has an economic and commercial policy that is not about trade and investment out. It's about drawing people into the American markets. We don't have a lot of resources that we're going to be able to use to compete with the Chinese in terms of investment or trading opportunities, unless we decide to change our minds. And so this is, it's not an impossible struggle, because at the end of the day, the United States, in most of the countries of the Western Hemisphere, has commercial relationships that are over 100 years old, and has company presence and investment that are over 100 years old, and have played a fundamental role in every aspect of economic development. But that can be lost.
My name is Dante Lawrence. I'm a senior at Georgia Southern University. First of all, thank you, Ambassador Shannon, for giving these remarks. I have a question about the technology and specifically hard power, soft power. As the United States of America shifts from being maybe the only hegemon on Earth, do we have to develop another way to interact with our own hemisphere versus hard power, soft power, the things we used to be able to do as the hegemon with the emerging markets and the emerging other countries we can't do anymore? Specifically, for example, the things in sub-Saharan Africa with developing countries and what's going on within the Balkans, kind of like the 92, 93 thing with happening in the Balkans. Have we not learned from that? And can we use those informational tools that we've had in the past toward our own hemisphere?
No, thank you for that. It's a really good question, and not an easy one to answer, because, I talked earlier about societies and cultures and the importance they're going to have in informing how nation states behave. But we have to find ways of using that to communicate into these societies so that we're not just talking to the governments, we're talking to entire peoples. But it requires a level of empathy on our part that is challenging. Not that Americans are not empathetic. It's just that we're really busy. We got a lot going on. And how are we supposed to guess what's going on in the head of a Brazilian? But we don't have to, because we have these people here already. And I'm going to give you an example. It's kind of trivial, but it's not unimportant. In 2011, when I was ambassador in Brazil, Barack Obama visited Brazil. And when I would go to the Brazilian Foreign Ministry and ask them, what is it that you want from the visit of President Obama, they would invariably tell me, we want U.S. support for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council for Brazil. In other words, they thought that was how Brazil would be identified as a great power, by having a seat on the UN Security Council. It's not happening. But if I were to walk out the front door of the foreign ministry out into what's called the Esplanade dos Ministérios, which is like the mall in Washington, D.C., and grab the first Brazilian who came by me and said, what do you want from the visit of President Barack Obama? That person would say, I want a visa waiver program, which means I want to be able to travel to the United States without getting a visa, without having to pay $160 for each member of my family, without having to go to American consulate in either Recife, Rio, Sao Paulo, or Brasilia, and pay the travel expenses and the hotel expenses and everything else. I just want to be able to get on a plane and go to the United States. And you would think that we would jump all over that. But we're so concerned about undocumented migration and all that kind of stuff that we still haven't gotten there yet. Even though in my day, at $160 a visa, we were doing 4,000 visas a day. So you do the math. We were like a mid-cap company when it came to revenue generation. But that was nothing, because the average Brazilian family of, say, 4 or 5 was spending at least $20,000 in the United States. So this was like a win-win in which two societies could meet, they could engage, they could converse, and yet we were really struggling to reach that point. And so the only reason I mention this is that to get to the answer to your question if we're going to move past hard power and even kind of the more caricatured uses of soft power, we need to become really aware of what people want and need in their lives, and what they can get from us in order to be successful. And in this regard, during the Cold War, diplomacy was kind of easy because the Cold War was like kind of a magnetic field. It automatically ordered the world. You're either on this side or that side. But today, that's not true anymore. And although some people would like to do that with China, it's not going to work. And so the way that you attract people is by showing that you are relevant to their success. And that's what we have to do. In the kind of competition we face in the world today, even with our ability to destroy everything, we have to be able to show that we're relevant to the success of other peoples.
Good evening. I have a question. Do you believe that America is already a very large military presence around the world and predicted to grow even higher under President Trump's second term? Do you believe that will draw us closer or further away from fellow nations in the Americas?
Well, the interesting thing about the Americas is that we have almost no American troops stationed around our hemisphere. There are several hundred American troops, actually probably several thousand American troops in Honduras at Sotocano Airfield, where we operate what's called Joint Task Force Bravo, which has been operating since the 1980s and does mostly counter-drug and humanitarian-related missions in and around the Caribbean and Honduras. We have some presence in El Salvador, mostly drug interdiction presence. But other than that, the other military presence we have are really within embassies. When it comes to kind of major concentrations of troops around the world, they're mostly in the Middle East right now, and Korea, the Korean Peninsula. And the Korean Peninsula are there for defensive reasons. So I don't think that's changing anytime soon. The Middle East will have to wait and see. But listen, here's the thing. Our military presence around the world reflects the kinds of security commitments we've made over time. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, do these commitments make sense? And are we carrying somebody else's load for them that they could carry? And if we weren't carrying it, what would it mean over time? And this is a challenging conversation to have, because so much of our presence abroad is built by long-term strategy and long-term budgeting and spending considerable amounts of money in order to keep troops in place. But here's a story. You might have heard about it. It's been reported and described in books. But during President Trump's first term, Secretary of State Tillerson and Secretary of Defense Mattis were concerned that the president really didn't understand the nature of American presence, security presence around the globe, nor did he really understand the kinds of commitments, security commitments we had made over time. And so they decided that they were going to do a large briefing for the president at the Department of Defense. And they brought in all their combatant commanders to brief the president, plus the chiefs of all the different branches of the armed forces. It was a very high-powered briefing. But in the course of the briefing, first of all, President Trump can't be briefed. He briefs. He learns I worked for him for 18 months, he has to be part of the conversation. And so you have to fashion your briefings and your engagement with him in a way that he's not sitting there listening to you, that he is interacting constantly. And that doesn't happen at DOD. They've got slides and projected points, and And about a half an hour into the briefing, the president stood up and he started walking around, obviously upset. And he was not just upset by the briefing itself, he was upset by what he was being told. Because what he was being told is that we have an array of forces around the world that can pitch us into significant combat at any moment, not depending on us, but depending on somebody else, on whether or not they choose to attack us. And his attitude was, wait a minute, I'm in charge, not somebody else. And he was very uncomfortable with this. And in fact, he was so uncomfortable, he said, look what you guys have done. You've exposed us. You've overextended us. We can't defend all these points. How am I supposed to do this? And it was a very difficult briefing because he also called these guys losers. And he said he didn't want to go to war with any of them. But he was saying something important, which is that somewhere along the line, we have to rethink the kinds of commitments we've made. And we have to make sure that we haven't created weakness for ourselves by where our troops are. And I would argue that a really good example of this was U.S. occupation of the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War. Because after the Japanese went after Hawaii, where did they go? They went to the Philippines because they were going to get us. And we were overexposed. We couldn't defend our troops in the Philippines. We had to surrender in the Philippines. And that's a hell of a way to start a war. Have your Pacific Fleet destroyed and have your army in Asia captured. And in fact, Walter Lippmann, who is a journalist and a big thinker about all things social and political in the first part of the 20th century, wrote a book called The Shield of the Republic, which was arguing that the United States had been so overexposed through the 1920s and 30s that it invited attack. And that World War II, which should have been fought only in Europe, had to be fought in both Asia and Europe because of security commitments we had made over time that we couldn't live up to. And so this is a long way of saying that the important part of your question is we need to think about where we are, why we're there, and can we protect ourselves?
I'd like you to address Central America. Central America certainly does not have the resources that South America has. It has terrible trade deficits. The countries may be ruled by civilians, but many are authoritarian. They have a reputation for corruption to the point that the people do not trust their judiciary, the police, or their governments. My question to you is, what kind of carrots or sticks can the United States offer to at least address the corruption problem in Central America?
That's an easy one. No, but it's a really important one because guess what? You know, I started my career there in 1984, and the United States put enormous resources into Central America, supposedly to beat back Soviet and Cuban communism and to put in place democratic governments, and then negotiated a series of free trade agreements that were designed to open up these economies and build investment opportunities that were going to uplift the people. And at the same time, we fashioned development assistance programs that were designed to address extreme poverty and the most difficult aspects of economic and social advancement. And we've had some success, but also, as you rightly note, not always. And there are some really significant challenges in Central America today. And some of this is about the deeply rooted natures of our societies and our economies, and the way in which these economies and societies have developed over time. It also has to do with the unique aspects of each of these countries. Because although it's a small space, Guatemala is different from El Salvador, from Honduras, from Nicaragua, from Costa Rica, from Panama, in some really, really significant ways. But I would argue that one of the things we need to do is, first of all, address the political fragmentation and fracturing that has taken place in that region. And then look for ways to use both Mexico and Colombia to connect the economies of the region, especially when it comes to infrastructure and energy, so that you can reduce energy costs, increase infrastructure, build greater industry, and generate the jobs and employments necessary to keep people in place and to involve them in politics. But there's something else that we can do and we should be doing, which is that at least in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the societies of these countries are now transnational societies. People in these societies are at home in Maryland as they are in their country, because there's been so much movement of people. And historically, this was true for Mexico, for the Philippines, for the Dominican Republic, but now it's true for much of Central America. And yet we haven't found a way of capturing that and using it to advantage. And there's a couple reasons why we haven't been able to do that. One is our immigration structures and systems. What we have done by hardening and securing our border is that we've trapped within the United States undocumented aliens. They can't leave because they can't come back once they leave. And if we were to develop visa systems that promoted circularity, that allowed people to come in, work, and then go home, we would have fewer Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans in the United States today. But we would have a regular flow and a familiarity between peoples that would allow for enhanced relations between governments. And it would allow us to more equitably manage the flow of remittances and monies that go back and forth. Do you know that in Honduras last year, the remittances, or the money that Hondurans send back to Honduras, represented 27% of their gross domestic product? That's more than a quarter. That's more than any single industry. It's more than agriculture. It's more than energy. And the same is true for El Salvador and Guatemala. And yet, for instance, for those who are in salaried positions, who have status, in other words, they're paying into Social Security systems in the United States, that money is being confiscated by the United States government, because we have no agreements with the countries that allow us to make whole their Social Security if, say, a Guatemalan worker in the United States decides to return to Guatemala as a 60-year-old man. He can't take his Social Security contributions to Guatemala and then plug into Guatemala's Social Security network. And we could and should be doing agreements called totalization agreements with these countries that allow us to transfer funds, Social Security payments made by people over time, in order to allow them to go home. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that at the end of the day, a lot of the problems you described are national problems that we can't solve by ourselves. They have to be solved internally in these countries. But there are plenty of ways in which we can contribute, along with partners in the region, in ways that give the people in these countries the tools necessary to address the problem.
We have time for two more questions over here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shannon. You mentioned in your comments that Canada and Mexico are the two largest trading partners of the United States, and that those relationships have been in existence for 100 years. Very recently, your new president, has announced that rather stiff tariffs are going to be imposed on imports to the United States from Canada and from Mexico, presumably in the interests of the well-being of the United States. If you were to advise Prime Minister Trudeau or President Sheinbaum of what kind of reaction our two countries should have with the United States to the United States decision, what would you say? Oh, and by the way, we're not going to be your 51st state.
Right. Understood. Understood. And Wayne Gretzky will not be the governor. Right.
That's too bad.
Listen, the tariff thing is real. Okay. I have no doubt that the president-elect will begin imposing tariffs on people, or on countries, or on economies and markets. The question is, who gets hit first and at what levels? Because his purpose is to begin the final teardown of global trading structures and systems that he disagrees with, and that he believes have drawn extraordinary amounts of money out of the United States and put into the rest of the world. He believes this is an issue of fairness. If economists are to be believed, the American people are going to pay for this because of increased prices. But as far as our trading partners are concerned, here's the issue with Mexico. President Trump says that his three priorities in our near neighborhood in the Western Hemisphere is migration, fentanyl, and China. If most of the migrants coming in the United States are coming through Mexico, and if most of the fentanyl coming into the United States is coming through Mexico, and if you're concerned about China establishing a position for itself in Mexico as a platform from which to trade into the United States, if you want to stop that, you need the cooperation of the Mexicans. I think imposing tariffs on Mexico are not going to win that kind of cooperation. And the same can be said of Canada. I mean, Canada deserves to have a finger wagged at them because they're free riders on security. They are paying below just about every other NATO member when it comes to percentage of GDP for security. And that was largely done by Prime Minister Trudeau to finance his own social programs. That's Canadian politics. But Trump is gonna look for a way to get the Canadians to bump that up, and get them to contribute a percentage of GDP for defense spending that equals what the Europeans are now paying. And so he's using the tariff threat to get that out of the Canadians, and it's a threat. But again, in 2026, the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, which is the trading agreement that took the place of the North American Free Trade Agreement, is up for review. And this is another moment in which the United States believes it will be able to pressure the Canadians and the Mexicans to do what we want them to do on certain trading issues and disputes. But the problem I see here is that it's going to be very difficult for President Trump to reach his migration, fentanyl, and drug trafficking goals, much less his concerns about China, if he's not prepared to draw these countries in economically and take advantage of that relationship. So The the short answer to your question is this is going to be really hard.
Fortunately, we only have time for one more question.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Shannon, my name is Gabriel Harper, a junior of international studies at Georgia Southern. Now, I'm not up my own tailpipe. That's not why I'm telling you, but I'll get to the reason that's relevant in just a second. Over the course of this conversation, you've absolutely convinced me why the U.S. relationships and the Americas matter to the well-being of the United States. I'm also the kind of person that does have the time and the interest to sit here and absorb this information and is incredibly invested in it. But you said earlier that Americans are busy, which I do believe to be as a truism, generally speaking. So if we're flipping the script a little bit here, you are any administration, either the current one, the incoming one, or one in the future, and I am your janitor. I am, a teacher that's underpaid and overworked. The people that typically drive American policy, I think it would be fair to say. Why, or better, how would you as an administration communicate to me, the world weary, why Central America and why South America matter for policy far more than these other countries that they're seeing in the news, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Sudan? How do you communicate that to a tired constituency?
I love this question. Where do you live?
I live about an hour north here in Statesboro.
You have a pupusaria near you?
I can't say that.
Okay. I live in Northern Virginia, and there's pupusarias everywhere. Pupusas are a Salvadoran food. They're a filled tortilla, usually with meat or cheese or beans of some kind. And I mean, this differs kind of around the United States. But what's striking for me, I just talked about these transnational societies, is the way in which migration has fundamentally reshaped American communities. And I have a brother who lives in Bourbonnais, Illinois, in Kankakee County, about 45 minutes to the south of Chicago. And Kankakee used to be a blue-collar community of larger Chicago. Has a couple industries in the area. But if you go to Kankakee County today, it's full of taquerias and Mexican restaurants. Because if you draw like a 45-minute circle around Chicago and a 45-minute circle around Indianapolis, it misses Kankakee County. And so the Mexicans know that there's not going to be any federal agents in Kankakee County, or not very often. So they come and go. In fact, there's bus lines that run straight into northern Mexico, into Chihuahua and Michoacan, that take Mexicans back and forth. And they work on the farms, they work in the slaughterhouses, they work all over the place. And the reason I'm mentioning this, and the reason I asked you if there's any pupusaria near you, is that I think for a lot of Americans, it's just a question of like opening your eyes and take a look around, and you'll see these people are here. And they're producing, and they're working, and they're part of our society, and that this should, and that they have come here on their own, and in response to the demands of the American economy, and not because there's been some legal structure or some formal program that has brought them. And so we've layered our communities with undocumented, documented residents, citizens, in ways that become very challenging and confusing for Americans to understand. But that the first point in beginning to demand of our politicians that we take our hemisphere seriously, and we take the countries of Central America seriously, is to take their presence here seriously, to take the contribution they're making to our economy seriously, and then to find ways to ensure that we can continue to grow our economy and have the kinds of jobs that attract people, but do it in ways that give a degree of confidence to the American people that there is public order and rule of law. I'm not sure that's a good answer to your question, but as close as I can get right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, before Jim formally thanks Ambassador Undersecretary, former Acting Secretary of State Shannon for that truly thought-provoking presentation and answer to questions based on his long years of great service to the United States, I just wanted to mention what we have coming up in terms of programming. Next month, we'll have Ambassador Alice Wells here talking a little bit about South Asia and also about energy. She's the former Assistant Secretary of State for South Asian Affairs. Ambassador Stu Jones will be here to talk in March about a little bit about commercial diplomacy, but he's also been literally just 2 weeks ago started, less than 2 weeks ago, started his new job as president of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. So he's flush with those issues as well. In April, we'll be joined by former National Security Council official Peter Harrell, who will answer a question that I get a lot, and I think everybody gets a lot, which is, do sanctions work? He has the figures to kind of back up his argument. And then in May, we'll be joined by Ambassador Phil Reeker, who will come here to talk about Europe. And then after our summer break in September, we're going to do something a little bit different. I hope we'll be talking about sports diplomacy and what the United States, should the government be taking a more proactive role in promoting its own athletics overseas or international sporting events here in the United States.
If I could, I know all these people, and they're incredible. And they're really worth coming and listening to. But when Stu Jones is here, ask him to tell the story of his engagement to his wife.
All right, and that's a program that's been developed by Larry. So again, Larry, thank you. So this concludes our program this evening with our special thanks again to Ambassador Shannon for an enlightening, interesting, and engaging program, thought-provoking, that's for sure, on why U.S. relationships in the Americas matter to the well-being of the United States. So as Larry said, our next program is February 20th. It'll be right here. We hope to see you. Thanks for attending our annual meeting, and until then, stay safe and healthy. Thank you again.